The Ryzen 5 3600 has been one of the most popular CPUs that's on the market. Released back in the summer of 2019, this 6-core processor was touted as the best all-rounder CPU for gaming, streaming, productivity, content creation, and more. With this chip in the hands of so many consumers, it begs the question, will it bottleneck a fast GPU like an RTX 3090? And if so, how much performance are you leaving on the table? Well, that's what we're here to find out. Hey, if you enjoy content like this, drop a like, make sure to subscribe, and smash that bell so you never miss another video. Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, welcome back to the channel and I hope you've all been doing well. For this video, I wanted to take a look at some gaming benchmarks which include the Ryzen 5 3600 to see how much it'll bottleneck a fast, high-end graphics card in today's GPU market. When the Ryzen 5 3600 had launched back in 2019, it was mutually agreed upon within the PC hardware community amongst reviewers and enthusiasts that if you want a great value processor that does it all, then this 6-core CPU is the one to get. It offered excellent gaming performance comparable to other higher end and higher core count CPUs. It's very capable in regards to multi-threaded tasks thanks to those 12 threads, and it was quite cost effective. So naturally, it became one of the most popular CPUs to get. If you wanted to build an excellent gaming rig and you wanted a CPU that could pair well with pretty much any GPU at the time, but didn't necessarily need more than 6 cores, the 3600 fulfilled those requirements really well. When it was launched at a MSRP of $200, it was already delivering great price to performance, but as time went on, this CPU could have been found at most PC hardware stores for even cheaper. I remember seeing deals posted for the 3600 being sold at around 150 USD, which is just really good value. It couldn't be emphasized enough. I recall Tech Epiphany back in March of last year on Twitter posted some data from Mind Factory, who are a well-known German retailer, and the 3600 was just dominating in terms of market share. I mean, you have AMD already doing really well against Intel, but the 3600 was their best seller by far. Although that's just one retailer, but I think we can be safe to assume this is probably representative of what went on in most parts of the world, and that this chip is in the hands of many PC gamers. However, do note that recently, because of the whole PC hardware shortage, prices of Ryzen CPUs have gone up considerably. You can still buy a 3600 for around MSRP, but it can be argued that almost 2 years later, it might not have the same value appeal to it, and now with 10th gen Intel parts being discounted heavily, a 10600K, which goes for around $10 cheaper, is probably the better option. Anyways, in late 2020, we saw a whole bunch of new hardware get released from both AMD and Nvidia. This included new high-end graphics cards, as well as the latest Ryzen 5000 series of processors, based on Zen 3, which were a huge leap over the already impressive Ryzen 3000 series. I reviewed the Ryzen 9 5900X a couple months ago and found it offered impeccable performance in content creation, productivity, and gaming, though since the main focus of that review was the new 12-core part, much of the discussion involved comparing it to the previous gen 12-core part, the Ryzen 9 3900X. So what I wanted to do was take the gaming data that I had and more closely analyze the differences between the Ryzen 5 3600 and the Ryzen 9 5900X. Since the 5900X is one of the fastest gaming CPUs you can get, it'll give us a good insight as to how much performance is being held back by the previous gen Ryzen 5 3600 when paired with an RTX 3090. As I've said earlier, since this CPU was so popular, I'm sure there were many users who were rocking the CPU but considered upgrading to one of the new high-end GPUs like an RTX 3080 or 3090, as the graphics card is the part that's most often upgraded within their system. Question is, just how much of a bottleneck could they be facing in a scenario where you have a Ryzen 5 3600 paired with the fastest gaming GPU, the RTX 3090. The gaming benchmarks were conducted on a test bench with the following specs. The CPUs were installed on an MSI X570 Unify motherboard, and I'd made sure to turn off any PBO2 and Auto OC features as we're trying to just see the performance at stock. The CPUs were cooled by a Corsair H159 Pro XT 280mm all-in-one liquid cooler. For the RAM, we're using 4 8GB sticks of Patriot Viper Steel DDR4 memory, which was clocked at 3600 MHz with manually tuned CL14 timings. The graphics card is an Asus ROG Strix RTX 3090. For our storage device, we've got a 2TB Samsung 970 EVO Plus NVMe SSD, and powering all the components is an EVGA 1000 G3 80 Plus Gold certified power supply. The majority of titles were tested at 1080p with high settings with the exception of a few titles. 18 games were tested, which included titles from various genres that had been released over the last few years. We'll go over a handful of them and then do a breakdown with an 18 game average as to just save time, and I'm sure you guys don't need to see every single chart to get the idea. Alright, so with that said, let's take a look at our first title, which is CSGO. Here we see a massive difference between the two CPUs. The 5900X is 43% faster in this title when it comes to the average FPS, and is 37% faster when it comes to the 1% lows. Still, the 3600 offers excellent performance here. I'm sure nobody is really going to be complaining about how they're only averaging around 500 FPS and not 700 FPS at this point. As at this point, you're pretty much in the territory of diminishing returns when it comes to perceived smoothness. The next title I want to take a look at is The Elder Scrolls Online. This title, like every other MMO, is notoriously CPU bound, such that it relies heavily on just a single thread. Whether you have a 6-core CPU or a 64-core CPU, it doesn't matter, as single-threaded performance will determine which CPU is faster in this title. With that said, the 5900X is 30% faster in this title when compared to the Ryzen 5 3600. However, the 3600 still offers some very acceptable performance in this title, to the point where most users probably won't care unless they're a hardcore PvPer, or their goal is to set some record times in trials or dungeons. Hitman 2 is next, and this title shows us a massive 41% difference between the 3600 and 5900X for the average FPS, and 37% for the 1% minimums. That's definitely a lot of performance that's being held back on the 3090 from the 3600. I mean, is the 3600's performance bad? Not really, especially in a stealthy title like this, but the user will be missing out on some significant performance. I always like to include a racing title in my benchmark suite, and Forza Horizon 4 is my go-to. Surprisingly, this game shows us it's quite CPU bound, as here we're looking at a difference of around 38%. However, this is another one of those cases where, sure, the 5900X is faster by a lot, and is really letting the 3090 stretch its legs, but in a game like this, does it really matter? Probably not, as in this title, even if you are averaging around 60 FPS, then that's ample performance to let the player have a good experience. One of the more recent titles on the list is Cyberpunk 2077, and this game is more GPU bound than it is CPU bound. Of course, as evident by the 27% difference in average FPS, that a CPU like the Ryzen 5 3600 can bottleneck the RTX 3090 in this title, but the difference isn't as large as I had expected it to be, especially considering how heavily threaded this game can be, though the overall experience on the 5900X would be much smoother. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is another fairly recent title, and in this game we're seeing that even at 1080p, the difference between a Ryzen 5 3600 and Ryzen 9 5900X is virtually identical, so you don't have much to worry about here. The CPU bottleneck here is not really existent, as now we're dealing with a GPU bottleneck, and a major one at that. Mount & Blade 2 Bannerlord is an interesting title, as it is very CPU bound and scales well with multiple threads, and this game in the entire benchmark suite shows us the largest difference between the two processors at 57%. With huge battle sizes, it can be quite taxing on the hardware, and the 3600 is struggling to keep up here, whereas the 5900X would be giving you a much smoother experience. Now that we've gone over a few various titles, it's time we take a look at the 18 game average. We can see that the Ryzen 9 5900X is significantly faster than the Ryzen 5 3600, so clearly the 3600 is bottlenecking a fast GPU like an RTX 3090 by a considerable amount, and those margins would be very similar if a user was using an RTX 3080. As the difference between the 3080 and 3090 at 4K was only like 10%, then with lower resolutions the gap would be closer. So at a resolution like 1080p, a 3090 and 3080 are virtually identical. Then of course with slower GPUs like an RTX 3070 or 6700 XT, the margins would be even smaller. Keep in mind the severity of the bottleneck can vary depending on the game as well. As we saw in games like Mount & Blade 2, Hitman 2, CSGO, the differences are very large, but there were also a couple of titles like AC Valhalla and Red Dead Redemption 2 that showed us the 3600 offering the same performance as the 5900X, indicating the bottleneck was completely on the GPU and not the CPU. On average, we're looking at a difference of around 33% when taking into account the differences from all the games. It comes down to this: if you're someone who's trying to get the absolute best performance possible from a high-end GPU like the RTX 3080 or 3090, and you play a lot of competitive titles like Twitch shooters, then you might want to consider upgrading from the 3600. You obviously don't have to go for a 5900X, but even a 5600X would give you just as much performance. With that said though, I don't see most users spending this much money on these high-end GPUs, especially now, only to play at 1080p. Most users would be opting for 1440p or 4K, where the margins would be even smaller. Then you're going to be more GPU limited than CPU limited. Also, many of the titles seen here weren't even competitive FPS titles, and the 3600 paired with a 3090 was still offering fantastic performance. Even if you have a 144Hz monitor, you'd definitely be getting the most out of it. For those of you curious as to what the differences would be at a resolution like 4K, then here, I'll quickly flash through those results for you. You're pretty much 99% GPU bottlenecked here, where the 3600 and 5900X deliver an identical experience. So if you are planning on using one of these fast GPUs, but at a resolution like 4K or 1440p, then I'd say you probably don't have much to worry about in that regard. Honestly, if you were to ask me, like if I had a system with the 3600, I was gaming at 1080p and I wanted to just upgrade the GPU and get something like an RTX 3080, then I'd probably go for it. I'd test out multiple games, and if you're satisfied with the performance you're getting, then you can just, stick with this configuration and keep using it. If not, then you've got plenty of great options to upgrade to on the market, especially for AM4. The bottom line is that the 3600 still remains a viable option for those in the PC hardware market that want a capable gaming CPU but don't necessarily want to break the bank, especially if you can find it heavily discounted for around $150. I hope you guys found this video to be informative and helpful. Let me know your thoughts down below. Check out the video description on ways to support the channel and for my other videos. If you guys are interested in more content like this, then make sure you subscribe. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you guys in the next one.